Good Friday morning, everybody. Today what I'm going to do is I'm going to start talking to you briefly about Gregor Mendel, who is the father of genetics. I'm going to just give you just a really quick rundown on Gregor Mendel, and then I will have you do a reading with questions for my CP classes, and honors I'll ask you to do the reading as well as take notes on the reading. Okay, just a real brief outline. This is an outline of the reading, so I'm going to kind of run through this real quick. Our objectives for this section is to explain where organism gets its unique characteristics. So why is it that when one dog is bred with another dog, the offspring of those results in some blend of the traits of both parents. Just like you and I are also a blend of our parents. We may look a little bit like one or the other, but for the most part, we're a blend of the two. How is it that different forms of a gene, and there's a term for that, it's called alleles, how are they distributed to offspring, meaning how are they passed on to their offspring? And that really becomes a really important conversation as we move forward. And we don't really talk about it until about the end, sadly. I'll try to throw that in as we move along. But it is a term known as meiosis. It sounds very similar to mitosis, and it has some similarities, but some very specific differences that will separate the two processes. So here's Gregor Mendel, and his experiments were on peas. They refer to that as the model system, or in some cases may be referred to as a model organism. And essentially that's what he studied. In the reading, it's going to talk to you about why he studied peas, and they're saying it has to do with the size of the organism, easily bred, but in essence, really, it had to do with the fact that Mendel worked in the gardens of a monastery. He was a Austrian monk, and he worked in a monastery, in the gardens of the monastery. He was in charge of the gardens, and peas were something that were readily available to him. And in a way, he kind of got lucky with his choice of plants to work with. He started with what is going to be referred to as true breeding plants, meaning that every time he crossed a certain trait with the same trait, the result was that same trait. So a trait is going to be the specific characteristic of an individual. In this case, they're going to talk about in the peas, the seed color, the plant height. For you and I, it might be our hair color, our eye color. Those are our traits. The term hybrid is going to be used in various ways, and so hybrid is going to be created when we cross two breeding individuals of different breeds, or true breeding individuals. So in the case of the peas, it's going to be like true breeding green peas with true breeding yellow peas, and then they look at what is the result. So just a real quick note on plants and flowers, because he really worked very closely with flowers, and it was a big deal about his research. So flowers have a female part. That's this middle portion here. Top part is a sticky part, and I'm just going to do it real quick. And the three dots here in the middle are going to be the ovules, or you and I might refer to them as the eggs. And maybe at this point they may not be fertilized. These are the parts that will become ultimately the seeds or the peas. Then there is the male parts. The male part is the top portion of the male part is the anther, and that's the part that makes the pollen. And the pollen is essentially the sperm of the plant. It's the male sex cell of the plant. So we have the male sex cell, and we have the male sex cells produced here, and the female sex cells are here. And they have to be transferred. Typically in peas, it's the petals surrounding the pea sex organs are enclosed inside the petals, so they don't often cross with other peas. So Mendel and the other monks that he worked with, what they would do is they would remove the male parts from one flower and just leave behind the female part. And they would take something like maybe a paintbrush, and they would pick up the pollen from the male part of one plant, and they would log all this down. They would write all this information out into books. They kept copious notes, and they would transfer it over onto the female part, which would then fertilize the eggs that would then produce the seeds. Very tedious, work that they were doing. And again, they logged all that information down. So this is like a little table looking at the characteristics of peas. There were 7 characteristics, and so they looked at the shape of seeds, and they noticed that there was 2 varieties of shape. They were round and wrinkled, that they were different colored seeds, that peas came in yellow seed color or a green seed color, that their flowers were either purple or white. And this is what made everything just perfectly wonderful working with the peas, is because they had these really simple characteristics. It was really just one or the other. It was no blending, which really panned out well for him. The shape was smooth or constricted, which would mean that the peas were not visible, or the peas would be visible through the pod. The colors of the pod seemed to be different than those of the peas themselves. So you could have a green pod but yellow seeds, or a green pod with green seeds. And so the pod color was separate from the pea color. And then the position of the flowers, whether the flowers were what's known as axial, were they along the stem, or were they terminal at the end of those stems? And then the heights of those plants. Again, it seemed to, interestingly enough, they noticed that the peas just came in two heights. There was no medium height. There was just either tall or short, and this really kind of helped in their work. So here are some quick terms that you're going to be inundated with over and over again. Genes, we're going to try to use these 2 terms correctly. Genes is that characteristics that exists on a chromosome, and it's going to be determined by the individual's characteristics. And that's going to be the thing that we talk about that's being passed on from one generation to the next. The allele is the form of that gene, that form of that trait. So our case here is our seed shape is the gene, and the alleles, those individual characteristics, you can either have a round allele or you can have a wrinkled allele, and then the result would either be a round or a wrinkle depending on the trait, whether the terms we're going to be using are going to be called dominant and recessive. So characteristics such as seed color are going to be determined by genes. The yellow and green seed colors are determined by those alleles. Okay, so that individual form of that trait. And then the allele for yellow seeds, in this case, appears to be dominant, because when we cross a green with a yellow, which, by the way, that was back here, wasn't it? When we cross a green with a yellow, the result is yellow seeds, which therefore must be, yellow must be dominant over green. All right, so the principle of dominance is another term that's going to come up very regularly. So some alleles are dominant, and that only matters when it has another allele, and that allele is different. And so if one allele covers up the other, we're going to say the one that does the covering up is dominant, and the one that is kind of like disappears is recessive. An organism with at least one dominant allele will exhibit that dominant trait. If you have 2 recessive alleles, then you will have the recessive trait. So if you have 1 or 2 recessive alleles, both the result there is the appearance will be whatever that is recessive. So Mendel's F1 cross, F1 is filial, and this is his first generation. And he has the parents here, and so each of these traits, he's exhibiting or showing that the parents in these cases are going to be true breeding. So true round crossed with true wrinkled would result in a round seed. It's not wrinkled, which must mean that the wrinkle must be recessive, and therefore the round is the dominant because the wrinkle disappeared in the offspring, and that's the F1, is the first offspring. And the wrinkle essentially kind of like disappears. It doesn't really disappear. The allele is still there. It still exists on one of those chromosomes that it received from one of the plants. And the same thing with the yellow cross with green results in yellow. Isn't that funny? Because we always think of peas as being green peas, but actually no. It's not because it's dominant. It's because the peas that we consume, that we buy at the store, are mostly what we're going to call true breeding green, or we're going to use the term later on. I'm trying to avoid using that term right now, but it's called homozygous. Same thing with flower color. You can see these, and you'll see these in the reading as well. So I'm going to try to not spend too much time on this. I don't only have 15 minutes for my videos, so I'm going to try to keep it, not have to do more than one a day. So again, which results in all of these offspring being hybrids. So each of these have one of each of these traits, even though they disappeared visually in the offspring or phenotype. Phenotypically, physically, they may be round, yellow, purple, smooth, green, axial, and tall. The reality is that they still have that form of that trait, that allele, still exists on one of their chromosomes. It just doesn't show up. All right, so another term that is going to be regularly used will be called segregation, and segregation means that the alleles are separated, and so the alleles separate and then are recombined in their offspring, and we're going to be doing something called Punnett squares a little later in another day. I'm not going to do those today. We'll revisit that on Monday. This was kind of how Gregor Mendel looked at his P's, but later on in the early 1900s, by the way, I didn't really talk about that. I'll try to circle back on that if I have time. Yeah, later on in the 1900s, Mendel's work was in the 1800s, but it was years later after Mendel actually passed away that his work was rediscovered. And yeah, and then we end up today calling him the father of genetics. And at the time, no one really knew much about Gregor Mendel. He was just a monk working in a garden. P is a parent generation, and F is going to be their offspring, and this is going to be the first offspring. We'll call them F1. I'll use these expressions more so probably in my honors classes, most certainly than I will in my CP, but don't be discouraged. So, and then when we cross the F1 plants, or even what would be referred to as a self-pollination event, same idea. F1 crossed with another F1, two individuals from the same generation. They're going to result in what we're going to refer to as the F2. All right, so the what proportion of the offspring are short? And it says 1/4. That's here, 1 out of the 4. And so we're using some really simple math here. And which proportion of the offspring ended up being tall? And the result there was F2. Okay, so moving right along, and the formation of gametes is going to be another important conversation, and that's again the formation of gametes. We're going to reviewing that later is meiosis, and again we're going to look at we're going to start representing these alleles as letters, and so like for instance a capital letter will be what we refer to as the dominant allele, and the lowercase letter will be referred to as the recessive allele. And so when meiosis occurs, the formation of that pollen or ovule, those alleles which reside on or exist on chromosomes, they separate. And so every sperm, or in this case pollen, or ovule, only gets one form of those alleles. And then when they pollinate, the two alleles will come together again, because those two chromosomes, you get 1/2 chromosomes from the female, you get 1/2 the chromosomes from the male, and so they recombine in those fertilized ovules or fertilized eggs. So these would be the eggs and sperm, or pollen and ovule. These would be the fertilized ovules or fertilized eggs. Okay, so I hope you all are holding up just fine. I know that for myself, it's tough being home all the time. You want to get out and about, but yeah, keep washing your hands, practice social distancing, stay in touch with one another, be positive. Okay, I wish you all very well, and I hope to see you very soon. Okay, take care. Send me any questions, jhagen@rsu13. And let me know how you're doing, and post your assignments onto Google Classroom. Take care, everybody.